Sorry. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. We'll probably start in about 5 minutes. Our second speaker has just said she is she just needs the link in order to log in. So it'll be another couple of minutes. Thanks.
Hey.
Hi, Neasa. Gavin, are you there or have you stepped out? Gavin Gleason, that is.
I'm here.
Oh, great. Okay. Thanks very much, everybody, for coming along this evening. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen for a moment. Yeah, thanks very much for coming, everybody. So my name's Ailish Ryan. I'm a member of the Workers' Party, a member of Ard Comhairle, and thanks a million for coming. Just to give everybody the background, the Workers' Party had a debate in relation to nuclear power and its role in the environmental crisis and in energy generation at our last Ardèche, which is our annual party conference. And the conclusion of that debate was that it was an issue that party members wanted to engage in more, learn more about before coming to a clear party position about nuclear power. And so since that Ardèche, the party has been carrying out discussions at branch level, and the Party Ard Comhairle has been asking for submissions from members to give us a sense of their opinions on the issue. So as part of that, Gavin Gleason, who very much has his mind made up and is not on the fence about the issue, drafted one position paper which sets out the case in favour of nuclear power. And we wanted to organise a debate in order to enable party members, but also people outside the Workers' Party, to consider the issue of nuclear power, and to enable members in particular then to come up with a view on what the Workers' Party's position on it should be. So we're delighted to have Gavin, who wrote that discussion paper, here. Gavin is speaking in a personal capacity, but he is a member of the Workers' Party and he's a member of Ard Comhairle also. And we also have Neasa Hourigan here, who is a TD for the Green Party. I'm just going to name her here. And I believe the Director of Research for the Green Party, or was at one point. She's been heavily involved in developing policy for the Green Party as well. I won't attempt, I'm not actually quite sure on what the Green Party's official position is on nuclear power, but I'll let Neasa introduce all of that. So basically what we're going to do is Neasa and then Gavin will have 10 minutes each to put forward their position in relation to nuclear power. So Neasa will be setting out the case against the nuclear power being essential. Gavin will set out a case for nuclear power being essential to our green transition in Ireland. We'll then have, we'll give each of the speakers a couple of minutes to respond to any points that were raised by the other speaker. And then we'll move to questions and answers for about 20 minutes. So if you have any questions and answers, it'll take place at that point. At the end, both of the speakers will have a chance to sum up and to give closing arguments, I suppose. I'm not sure we'll quite have a vote on which way we think the debate went, but you know, you're a rowdy bunch. I'm sure people will make their views known. So just to make you all aware, we are recording the meeting and it's going out live on Facebook. Yeah, I think we'll probably be about an hour to an hour and a quarter. We should be well wrapped up before 8:30. Okay, so I'll hand over to Neasa first, if that's all right. And if anybody has any problem with technology, just send me a message either here or on Facebook if you have me on Facebook. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. So thanks for having me tonight. I hope everyone can hear me. I had better tech, but it turns out only some of my devices want to do what they're told tonight. First of all, I guess what I'd like to say is I am not an expert on nuclear energy. But I do know our own position on it, and I have kind of read a good bit about it over the years. So I hope I can, you know, do a fair job of outlining both my own position and the Green Party position. The Green Party position is kind of like almost a legacy issue or a historical issue, is that they're a Guinness. And that has been the case for many as a decade now. The Green Party is 30 years old, and I think being fairly suspicious of the development of nuclear energy in all its forms has characterized aspects of the party the whole way along. I think that's fair to say. I personally don't feel that kind of emotive feeling around nuclear energy. I know for some people it's kind of a key red line issue. I personally don't feel like that. So I guess I can only put forth the discussion in a way that makes sense to me. However, it is true to say that I'm not a fan of the nuclear option for the reasons I'm about to lay out tonight. But I do think it's really encouraging to have these debates. I don't think there's any technology or any debate that should be off the table, because I think it signifies a widespread political consensus that we can't go on as we're doing. Our use of fossil fuel has to end, and we do need to find alternatives. And I think that that's incredibly, and that's a really encouraging move for everyone across the political spectrum to make. And I also think that particularly when it comes to nuclear power in a post-Fukushima world, and in a, considering that we're all watching the melodrama of Hinkley play out, that's a tough sell in general. And so, fair play for having the debate. So as I said, I don't believe that nuclear power will play a significant role in a post-carbon emission world in our new future. I specifically don't believe that it adds up as an option for the island of Ireland. But I guess before I go through the detail of why I think that, I think it's worthwhile contextualizing where I see this debate situated and why it's important to contextualize it. So you might know, or you might not, that I come from a construction background, and that's how I would have found my way into the Greens. It's not from a kind of a biodiversity or an ecological point of view. It was very much through my profession, where I was a specialist in advising people how you make low carbon buildings, how you make low carbon communities. And I spent a lot of time sitting down with clients who want that to be the case, and they would come to you, and they will often come to you and talk about, we're going to do solar panels, and let's buy an air-to-air heat pump. And there was always a point in the conversation where I have to stop them and have to explain in a very simple and important reality, which is that before you buy the fancy technology, you have to completely reimagine the fabric of your building or the fabric of your community and how it works. So the reality is to produce less carbon emissions, we have to use less energy. Now, that's probably the most boring anecdote hopefully you're going to hear tonight, but it is really, it's an important point to impact the level of what we consume and to build a new low carbon future. We will have to manage the manner in which we consume things. So no technological solution, but be that nuclear or renewables or fossil fuels souped up or hydrogen or nothing will properly prepare us for what that future holds. It won't paper over the cracks. So, I guess I'm going to assume that people don't necessarily listen to what I have to say in the media, but you might notice that I very rarely use the words degrowth, and I hardly ever say the word anti-capitalist, but I do think that we have to situate this discussion in a larger discussion around the systems on which our society is built. And I do think that discussion has to happen in terms of consumption and consumerism. They're not unrelated things. We are operating in a market-led society that is rooted in relentless growth and relentless consumption. And it locks us into all sorts of problematic realities and problematic systems, unfair working practices, unjust land use, economic inequality. We consume incredible amounts of food, of textiles, of energy. And the plan at the moment is for that to continue, and for us to somehow dream up better and better technological solutions to that. And I fundamentally don't believe that either nuclear energy or any other version of energy, whether that be renewable or otherwise, or indeed fossil fuels if they weren't so problematic, will satiate that monster. There will always be a need for more usage and more energy. And until we tackle that, until we look at that serious introspection, we won't deliver the real system change that we need. So in terms of the detail then of nuclear power, I guess that brings us into, I guess one of my key objections to nuclear power isn't necessarily the ecological one. I think that what I've just said about, are we looking for a technocratic solution or are we looking for system change? That's the discussion to me. And I think where nuclear power is really problematic for me is the issue around ownership and investment. So in green politics and environmental politics, you can spend a lot of time talking about land use or the pollution that's resulted due to the excavation of raw materials, for example. But ultimately, what all of those discussions are about is resources. Who owns them, who controls them, who benefits from them, who's hurt or damaged by their use, and who profits from them. So I think this is really important for nuclear power. The current model for development of nuclear energy is almost completely reliant on private investment. The reality of that private money gives rise to is some very strange power lines in the global north. This is national infrastructure that we're talking about. Now, look, I'm an internationalist, but let's talk about Hinkley for a second. To be built by the French and paid for by the Chinese, you saw high-powered Chinese officials being banqueted in Buckingham Palace only for the deal to run aground. I think that one thing to remember is one of the big proponents of nuclear power in globally is the French. But when the French moved into nuclear power, it wasn't anything to do with carbon. It was because it was a reaction to OPEC and the 1973 crisis, and they wanted to break that great French thing of not wanting to be too reliant. They wanted to break their reliance on international power structures in the form of fossil fuels, and I think that that's really, really important here, because for me, nuclear power locks you into big centralized base loads. And one of the things, and we don't always get it right with renewables, is that what you can do with renewables is you can have community models, you can have extensive rather than intensive grids, you can have, on-site, owned by the person options for energy. And that's something that nuclear cannot deliver to you. In terms of finance, I guess that kind of brings us to finance and the difference between both the level of finance needed for nuclear and the kind of microfinance you would have the option of with renewables. Although I don't really want to set up this argument about, is it nuclear or renewables? I think that's kind of a redundant argument. I do think that, fundamentally to me, every euro or every dollar that we spend on nuclear is a dollar or a euro that we're not spending on a better form of energy. And so it's not the best use of that euro or dollar, which are finite and which won't, should be spent in the best possible way. Every single nuclear project in the last 3 decades has been delivered pretty much overdue and over budget, and that's including some of the Chinese ones. Let's return to Hinkley. When they signed that deal, they signed up to pay over the odds in terms of energy, and so it's not delivering lower cost energy to your average homeowner. And if you are listening to me on media, you'll have heard me bang on about fuel poverty a lot. The investment required for nuclear, even if it wasn't coming from outside investors, and I'm not doing a Trump on it and saying China is evil, but even if it wasn't technology owned by another country and bankrolled by other countries, it's not necessarily delivering cheap energy to you. And the money side does have important impacts. In the US, the deregulated energy markets in the Midwest saw nuclear energy plants really struggling and being decommissioned earlier than they might be for all of the huge money and huge investment that gets put into it. And there is a huge economic impact to that kind of centralized energy creation in communities. So there's very little security of return there, and it doesn't necessarily allow for long-term investment. These are projects that tend to take more than a decade to deliver, and you're relying on private market finance to do that. So they have to lock themselves in for more than a decade. That's why you see so many of them. I believe, historically, it's 1 in 8 nuclear projects run aground. And so what you'll see is that long before these projects get commissioned, they just peter out and they fall away. I couldn't be a green politician and come on here and not mention the environmental aspects of it. as I said, personally, I'm not horrified by nuclear power. However, in the same way that I would do with any other material that I use in any other building, there is still no closed loop system for the disposal of nuclear waste. Now, while many technologies struggle with the provision of raw materials, the idea of cradle to cradle simply doesn't exist for nuclear in a way that it does for other technologies. And for Ireland in particular, in terms of the ecology and whether this makes sense, we have an incredibly dispersed and low density population, which would make both the siting and the construction of a nuclear power plant difficult, but also obviously the storage of the waste afterwards incredibly difficult. And we see that, those discussions happening in Northern Ireland. But also then you have to remember that in Ireland, we're a small island with a dispersed population, and wind and wave and solar energy. We're one of the most temperate climates in the world. It doesn't feel like that when you're getting rained on all the time, but we are. And finally, what I would say is the energy sector has simply evolved beyond nuclear. It's not just that it's financially unviable. It's not just that it doesn't offer really cheaper energy options, or that the stakeholders involved are undesirable because they're market-led and they don't deliver. But globally, when you look at what other countries are doing and what supra-international agreements are doing, is that we're moving towards a different vision of energy, which is much more about interconnectedness, and it's much more about on-site renewables and community ownership and the trade of those things. So we don't necessarily need big, large-scale baseload projects that are fundamentally becoming obsolete, both for financial and security reasons. What we need is intermittent coverage. We don't need always-on technology. So these big plants that are running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, won't necessarily mix with the other kind of energy options that we also want to provide and that people in their own homes want to provide. We need matrices of energy choices, not monoliths of energy choice. So I guess I'm going to finish up here and say, no matter what option we choose in terms of energy provision, I think it's really important that we keep two things in mind. One is that we tame the monster of our consumption, and no energy option is going to fix that for us. We have to fix that for us. And two is that if you, whatever energy options we do, we look at state-led provision and state-led investment. It makes me uncomfortable how little control we would have over a nuclear energy option. On both those counts that I outlined there, nuclear energy falls down for me. It's a centralized, technocratic, market-led solution that I don't feel will reflect the challenges that we have ahead. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Neasa. So I'm going to hand over to Gavin Gleason. Gavin, if you just want to set out, I suppose, the case in favour of nuclear, rather than, I suppose, diving right into Neasa's arguments, and maybe I'll give each person a couple of minutes afterwards then to disagree with any points made.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Neasa. That was very interesting. So I'm just going to go through why I think nuclear power is really an important approach to dealing with our current situation. So as everyone knows, we have very serious environmental issues that are coming up, not least of which is the release of greenhouse gases. And dealing with this problem is something that we really have to wrap our heads around. And I agree with Neasa that we need to work on increasing efficiencies in our society, and I think that's a really important point. However, we also really need power, and we need a lot more power, significantly more power than we're using today as a global society. So if we look right now at the amount of power that's being used, the average draw of power is around 2,500 watts. In Ireland, we use around 7,000 watts, and in China, they use around 3,000 watts, and the US uses around 10,000 watts. That's the average wattage per capita, okay? So even if we cut our energy use in half here in Ireland, we would still be trying to add 1,000 watts to the rest of the world in order to bring us up to that level. Now, in order to bring that down that significantly, we'd have to make really extreme changes in our infrastructure. And I'm in favor of those, but they involve things like mass transit, probably banning cars, creating combined heat and power systems. One of the big costs in Ireland is the inefficiency of housing, and that really should be solved in large infrastructural projects. So I think that it's important to keep in mind that large infrastructural projects are also something that has to be quite centralized and perhaps technocratic. It can be democratic in the sense that the polity can vote to have these things issued, but it really needs to be solved on systemic wide basis. And I don't think it's really viable to solve these problems on individual consumer basis or with small local approaches. It really needs to be large scale approaches. Now, in terms of energy, uranium is something that's actually present in Ireland, and there have been talks about mining it in Ireland because it is there. One of the first times I noticed it in marble, and then I went and looked online to see if there had ever been any uranium mining in Ireland, and in fact, they have done some prospecting, but no mining as yet. So in terms of having energy security, I think this would be a real boon for Ireland. It would break away from OPEC, for instance, and the rest of the world oil market, and give Ireland a lot of sovereignty and control. And that means more control for people to vote for various different ideas, rather than having to be influenced by really large-scale external factors that they can't control, which have a lot to do with the global security policies of the United States, Saudi Arabia, and other such countries. So nuclear power is also quite cheap, I think. Now, that I think flies in the face of what most people believe about nuclear power, because they see very large scale of investment that's required in order to build a plant. But if you look at the various countries that have adopted nuclear power, the cost to the consumer, it tends to be much lower than for other approaches. So for instance, France has one of the lowest energy costs per kilowatt hour in Europe, and Germany is almost twice as much per capita for the expenditure. In terms of, we can look at, I think Hinkley is a good example, because it's a nuclear project that went really far over budget, and is much more expensive than they had initially claimed. And yet, Germany underwent a project to remove nuclear power and to replace their low carbon emissions power with wind and solar. And that project has cost to date around 500 billion. If they, in the process of that, having shut down their nuclear plants, they've managed to change almost no greenhouse gas emissions at all. So they're almost at a standstill with what they had been before the Energiewende and those 500 billion had been spent. If instead they had bought those Hinkley plants, they would have a very low, very, very low greenhouse profile. They would be getting close to a zero greenhouse gas emissions. I would also contend that nuclear power is quite safe. I mean, obviously, Neasa didn't go into details about this, but there is a view that nuclear power is unsafe. Now, there was a very large-scale disaster at Chernobyl, which resulted in probably around 4,000 total deaths over the time period due to cancer, etc., over a very long period of time, around 4,000 deaths. But compared to other power sources, that's actually quite low. It was very punctuated and very localized in time and area, but it was actually quite low compared to, for instance, oil and coal, which appear to cause around 1 million deaths a year. So that's from various different factors. People die from inhalation of pollution. They die from all sorts of from explosions, from the removal of the coal from the ground, etc. So it's actually quite safe. But actually, nuclear is quite safe if you count the number of deaths per terawatt hour, compared to wind power and solar. In fact, it's just about ballpark the same. Now, the statistics in terms of death are quite low per terawatt hour for all three of those sources, but people do die from installation of wind power from the mine, and there's also other deaths that are probably not counted in that have to do with the access of the materials in the first place. So the waste issue is also quite manageable. And contra the claim that it's not cradle to grave, I would say that actually nuclear power is more cradle to grave than any other type of power that's generated, because the public has demanded a very high level of scrutiny over how the waste is managed. So every nuclear power plant, not only do they have to pay for the costs of the nuclear power plant, they also have to set aside money for decommissioning the nuclear power plant. And this is actually one of the reasons that these nuclear power plants were shut down prior to their intended lifespan, not because of the costs of using it, but because the companies, because they are private companies in the United States that were managing it, found that it was cheaper to shut it down and take the decommissioning money, because the decommissioning money had been built up to such an amount that they feel they can get a windfall profit from the decommissioning. So I would say that this is more a question of sort of incorrect incentives. And then in fact, what should happen is that the nuclear power should be built and managed by the state. And I would also say that nuclear power is much better than the alternative. So if we're looking at energy, it's really important to compare the energy with other types of energy that we can produce. And there are a number of different possibilities. We can keep going with oil and natural gas and coal, but I think most people know that that's a very serious problem. If we keep doing that, we risk constant global warming, we risk really severe environmental consequences. And even if one didn't believe in global warming, the environmental consequences of coal and oil are quite high, and the deaths per year being close to 1 million deaths a year is very high. Now, natural gas is much cleaner and it has much less in terms of pollution. However, it also has very extensive environmental impacts, and the extraction of natural gas is leading to fracking all over the place, which can pollute the groundwater and it can be very dangerous in itself. So compared to those alternatives in terms of environmental impact, it's also, I think, much better. Now, if we look at what it is required to actually make wind and wind power viable in Ireland as the primary source of power, we would be talking about a centralization that's much greater than would be required for a nuclear power plant. In fact, you would need a grid that was very, very extensive. It would have to be a very complex grid. It would have to be done entirely by the state anyhow, because it's very unlikely that a private company would be able to manage such a complex grid operation that had to be coordinated, and it would be a natural monopoly in itself. In order to ensure that people got reliable power, which I think is really quite critical. It's not, we can't have fluctuations in power and constant brownouts. That's the case in the third world, and it's a problem because it really disrupts productivity of people. And it will also, if you have brownouts in the winter, it will increase energy deaths from lack of energy. So if we were to try to institute this grid, using only wind power, we would also have to deal with the case where the wind is not blowing. And in Ireland, it's based on past numbers, looking at the wind over several years, that would require storage of some type that would be capable of storing enough power for an entire week. And that would require something like 500 Turlock Hills, that's a big power storage facility that uses a water battery, and that water battery allows them to release water and turn turbines and generate power, and then pump it back up when they have excess power. So you could use a system like this. However, 500 of them would be required to use wind power as a replacement for all of our coal and gas needs. And so I think in conclusion, the most feasible way of getting rid of decreasing the environmental impact and improving the decreasing the release of greenhouse gases, nuclear power really stacks up best. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Gavin. So I think I'll just give Neasa and then Gavin a couple of minutes. Neasa, if there's anything you want to respond to there before we go to questions and answers, and then Gavin, I'll let you do the same in terms of Neasa's presentation.
Okay, I won't take long because I like the questions and answers bits of these things. So I guess the point is, though, that I'm not proposing an all-wind grid. I think the point is that most countries are realizing that they need a calibrated grid between lots of options, a matrix of options that work together, and that no one option will solve all of our problems. And I think that when it comes to something like nuclear energy, first of all, it's not cradle to grave, it's cradle to cradle, so that you can reuse something over and over again. And nuclear energy doesn't necessarily factor that in. We do know that doing well, a nuclear energy project takes 10 years to construct. That's not including the early phases, the pre-planning and all of that kind of stuff. We also know that 2030 is our time, is our date for serious change in terms of our grid. So on that very kind of simple practical basis, nuclear energy just won't be ready in time. I still don't think that nuclear energy, I don't think really we've cracked the nut of how we can deal with the issue of who owns it and who controls it and who pays for it. Because you talked there a little bit, Gavin, about sovereignty and control, but we're a relatively small, we're not France, and we don't have the technological know-how to make a nuclear plant ourselves, and therefore we will have to buy that in, and we will also have to go and get the investment. Like, we can't even pay, we have to go to private investors to do offshore wind, when really that should be a state-led project where we should borrow money to do that ourselves and own it ourselves, and we're not doing that. We're going off to the market-led and allowing other people to make money off our natural resources. If we can't do that for a much lower price level of offshore wind, I doubt very much we're going to do that for nuclear. And finally, you mentioned at the beginning there that we should mine for uranium, and I think there's somewhere all over the country there's a whole load of Greens and they're feeling faint and their heads are exploding. I don't think we want to move into mining in this mining of uranium, because I think, you know, most countries, particularly in the developing world, will be trying to phase that kind of thing out.
Great. Okay. Thanks very much, Neasa. Gavin, is there anything you'd like to respond to from what Neasa said so far before we move to questions and answers?
Yeah, I guess in terms of cradle to cradle, so in France, when they get spent nuclear fuel, they remove it from the nuclear facilities and then they reprocess it, and that means they separate out a high level waste that has a relatively short lifespan. And then they take the remaining plutonium and uranium and they reprocess it into fuel. So they actually do full cycle recycling. Now, it's not the best recycling possible, but I think, you know, if the world decided to take a more nuclear direction, it would be possible to produce very, very little waste total from the entire nuclear process. The other options, now I think we have to look at, if you want a matrix of options, we have to think about what those options are. And if we're trying to reduce greenhouse gases, the only really serious ones are geothermal, hydropower, wind, and solar, and nuclear. And the geothermal requires very specific conditions. You have to be sitting on top of a volcano, essentially. So if you're Iceland, that's grand. If you want hydro, you also have to be geologically privileged. You need to have large fjords like Norway or something, or large mountains, the Alps, like in Switzerland or Austria, in which case you can get a lot of power from those solutions. Otherwise, what's left? Well, solar is not ideal for Ireland. and wind is really the best left option. And so the question is really between wind and nuclear, and that's what it kind of comes down to. Now, in terms of the resource and like cradle to cradle of wind, it's not great, because right now, when the wind turbines, which generally last a relatively short time span compared to a nuclear power plant, you actually take these and they take the blades off them and they bury them in landfills. So that's the kind of waste disposal. Whereas with nuclear power, the total waste from the entire life of from my entire energy usage over my entire life will fit into this cup. So all of the waste can be managed in a much more easy fashion than it can be for many of these other types. And the plants themselves, the amount of material use are tiny in comparison to wind power or solar. So in terms of the who owns it, that's actually a very good point about Ireland does not have the capacity to build a nuclear plant. It wouldn't have the capacity in the near term future. It would have to be a partnership. There's no other way. So you'd want it to be a state project. It would have to be a partnership project with some other country, but that would be more sovereignty than we currently have. We're not going to get the sovereignty from wind power if we can't actually make wind power the replacement for all of our greenhouse gas release. So in terms of the matrix, I mean, we have to be thinking about that. Now, I would suggest, we partner with somebody like France, who's quite close and really quite skilled at doing it. In terms of the 10 years to construction, there has never been a drop in greenhouse gas that was faster than the ones that were found in Sweden and France. And those both happened in about 15 years on a project of building nuclear power. Germany's 500 billion has caused no change in greenhouse gas release. So I'm maybe it's too late, but it'll be less too late than the other kinds of too late. So I think we have to really evaluate which would be faster, and I think that nuclear is really going to turn out to be the fastest approach to reducing greenhouse gas emission. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks very much to both Gavin and Neasa. So we'll just take any questions that people have there. So you can either put your hand up there virtually by clicking beside your name or below the participants, or you can turn on your camera and wave, cable? Or you can just jump in.
The extender. The extender.
Or you can stick a question in the chat box either for. Well, I have two questions. So, oh, sorry, David Halligan, is that you putting your hand up?
Yeah, sorry, I was a bit late there.
No, you're okay.
Hiya. So I know Neasa, I've canvassed with her before, so she might be surprised to learn that I'm actually quite in favour of nuclear power. And I've kind of seen the cost argument come up today. And I think, obviously the short-term investment cost is very high, but as Gavin said, France has shown that if you have a kind of a one-time state-led rollout, the long-term cost is actually quite cheap. France, Sweden, South Korea, they have among the kind of cheapest electricity for the consumer on their continents. So my question would be sort of to both is, do you think there's a bit of a double standard there between environmentalists who oppose nuclear power because it doesn't deliver that kind of short-term profitability, but they don't really make the same standard for renewables? I think nuclear is being quite demonized because it's a very emotive issue. People jump on the cost argument, but I don't think it really adds up, and I think there's a bit of a double standard there. So I'm just wondering what the two speakers would think about that.
Hey, David. Actually, I'm not surprised that, I think people have the idea that, people in the Green Party are absolutely terrified of nuclear power. And as somebody who's chaired many policy meetings, it comes up quite regularly. And there's always like a vocal cohort who want to look at the issue again. And we're having these kind of debates as well. And obviously, you know, there is a legacy issue there of people being quite worried about nuclear. And I think part of that is, you know, is a couple of decades of being scared and a whole load of kind of media analysis and also, you know, the reality of events scaring people. But as I said at the beginning, I don't think that should like stop us really looking at it seriously. I do think the money issue is less for me around, because you're right in one way, like we also need huge investment if we're going to do the renewables thing. And unlike nuclear, renewables are actually being, you know, they're being subsidized quite a lot at the moment. I think it's less about the amount of money, although the money is crazy, like 6 billion just to get a project off the ground before it's even commissioned and finished. And I think it's there's a Hitachi who bought the project in Wales is going to have to write off almost 3 billion because the project's just not going anywhere. 3 billion like is an incredible amount of money to write off. I think it's the instability of that level of money coupled with a very long lead in means that those projects often take on a turn that, you know, in its purest form, if you wrote it down on paper, it sounds okay. But then if you look at, let's say, the Hinkley version of it, they locked themselves into a price that was double what the price at the time in 2016 when they locked in the price. I think it was something like 92 euro per megawatt. The current, at the time, the contemporary price was 40 euro or 40 pounds per megawatt. And so I think that instability coupled with the huge investment required leads to some strange decision making and as I said before, kind of some strange power lines. So, you know, I think you're right. And I'm really, I guess I'm not coming at this as a kind of a protecting and advocating for renewables, because renewables, you know, that's a whole other debate, like all the issues and problems with that. And I take that point.
Thank you.
Okay, Gavin, do you want to come in on that question? There's a couple of others coming in there as well, so I might come back to those afterwards then.
I think he addressed it quite well, but I mean, the reality is, yes, I mean, the infrastructural costs of nuclear are very high, and because safety is such a great concern, much larger concern than with most other projects where, you know, you wouldn't care as much about the safety issues. I mean, for instance, in Japan during the Fukushima disaster, there was also that earthquake caused 5 people to incinerate instantaneously in a natural gas plant, which probably would have been avoidable. It was workers that were working at the plant if they had taken some safety precautions in management of the plants, but it wasn't considered to be important. Whereas only 1 person died of radiological causes at the Fukushima plant, and nobody was incinerated. So I mean, it's the infrastructural costs are going to be a really serious problem no matter what. But it seems to me that the scale of investment that's going to be necessary, like 500 Turlock Hills, it's going to be in the tens of billions. It's going to be billions and billions and billions. So if we're trying to, by 2030, get rid of greenhouse gases, we have to be thinking about, you know, really huge investments across the board.
Thank you.
Great. Okay, so there's a couple of questions there in the comments. One question from Paddy. Could someone give a ballpark figure of how much construction would cost for a nuclear plant and the equivalent for wind farms? So I presume for the amount of wind farms that would be comparable. Question from Rachel. Would the environmental cost of the mining for materials required for renewables be comparable to environmental costs of mining for uranium? So how does the environmental cost of mining required for both uranium or for renewables compare, taking into consideration the amount of energy generated subsequently by these mined materials?
Will I go first? My understanding, Gavin probably, as I'm not the expert, but Gavin probably know better. We for wind energy in Ireland in the next decade, I think the ballpark figure is 5 billion is the intention to spend. The average spend on a nuclear plant is between 6 or 7 and 10 billion. That energy doesn't add up, as in that's not producing the same energy, because the partner policy option with renewable energy is to also go ahead and retrofit all of your housing. So you'd be talking about another 5 billion. So possibly in cost that they're relatively equal, but in terms of like the investment package, they're quite different, as in you would need a partner, an estate, to go in for the full 10 billion as a package on a nuclear plant, whereas with a suite of options on renewables, you're talking about a number of different investors and then state-led investment in retrofit of housing.
Yeah, so there are quite a lot of complicated questions in there. I guess like Hinkley costs somewhere around 20. It's probably going to cost 25 billion when it's done. But 25 billion, that would be that's about what it would be required to replace all types of greenhouse gas releasing energy production in Ireland. So if we built one of those and we spent 25 billion, we'd pretty much clear it in one hurdle. That's I think a reasonable thing to attempt to do. And if we look at the direct wind costs are relatively low, but the problem is that you don't get over that hurdle. So you have to, because wind is so variable, it's so incredibly variable, you somehow have to make up that difference. And the main way it's being made up is either purchasing on the grid from some place like the UK, where a lot of their power is going to be generated by nuclear anyhow, after Hinkley is up, or you have to store the energy somehow. And so if you did the storage facilities like Turlock Hill, if you built 500 of those, well, that's going to be extremely expensive. The original cost in 1974 pounds was 22 million for one station, and now I'd say, I don't know, I haven't done the calculation, but it would be very, very expensive. I think it would definitely be more expensive than Hinkley Point C. So again, the costs are high, but the relative costs are not that high. In terms of the full cycle analysis of wind, solar, and nuclear, there's a very good paper that does a full cycle analysis and shows that the total mining impact from both wind and solar are worse in terms of the scale and size of the land area use necessary to per megawatt to a nuclear power plant. Nuclear power plants are the lowest of several options for greenhouse gas releasing objects, including geothermal, actually. So
thanks very much. So there's a couple of questions there. One from Jez asking around whether it's the case that uranium was one of the reasons that nuclear power was demonized was because uranium could also be used for weapons, and that newer thorium reactors are much safer. Is that correct? And secondly, a question from Michael: wouldn't a small power plant in Ireland, nuclear power plant, produce too much energy for 67 million population, meaning some would have to be exported? How would this work? And for the closed loop fuel recycling, wouldn't this require an additional hazard of building nuclear plants, plus a centralized infrastructure, plus some processing plants, and have to transport this fuel around the island? And then I just had a couple of questions which I might add to them. Just for Neasa, I suppose, I think, the idea of community-owned energy is very attractive. And you know, you've kind of counterposed that to, you know, kind of like enormous energy, enormous power stations that are financed and owned by private corporations. But I suppose I just wonder, like, who do you imagine bears the financial risk for that kind of community, those community-owned energy schemes? Like, do you think that the communities should be the ones who bear the financial risk if they overspend, if they go belly up? Like, what should be the repercussions? And if not, I suppose, how do you square the community being the ones who own something with the fact that, and get to decide how it runs, with the fact that maybe the state is the one who has to pick up the tab if it doesn't work? And for Gavin, I was just wondering about, I guess, you know, a lot of these kind of contentious technologies, or kind of scary technologies maybe, you know, we kind of like to say, oh, well, it'll be different when it's democratically owned. But the reality is really, you know, like, for it, it's unlikely that capitalism will end fast enough for us to make our energy transition and save the planet. So how do you feel about the potential for private corporate owned nuclear power plants in Ireland? Does that shift your views about it at all?
Who do you want to go first?
Gavin, do you want to go first? Maybe you've...
Yeah, sure. I'll go first on that. So the first question, or the last question, was about whether or not it would shift my views if it had to be done by a private corporation. And I think, yeah, I don't think private corporations have a brilliant track record on nuclear power. And part of the reason the United States nuclear power has been poor is because it's been driven by individual agendas of various different companies, and that has changed the way that they design them, all the way through to the way that they have been run, including the early decommissioning, which should never have happened, but it was one of these perverse incentive schemes that happened because of the large scale placed into a fund for decommissioning. So it would change my opinion. I think it should be done by the state. I think the amounts of investment that are required are going to require a state, and it will have to be with the state company anyhow, one of the state companies that does the large scale nuclear development, I think. So yeah. In terms of the uranium, what would be required for reprocessing? So that was one of the questions. Reprocessing would probably be done by France. I don't think that Ireland has the scale necessary to take on a reprocessing job. So France already takes reprocessing from many different countries. It's not all happening from France in the first place. So that's, I think, a good recycling option. And that way we don't have to keep the spent fuel in Ireland very long. In terms of the transport, it can be done by boat. Sweden transports all of their spent nuclear fuel by boat, and they have it's pretty impressive. You should look at their safety precautions, etc. They place all of the spent fuel rods inside of these gigantic sealed casks, which can withstand like almost anything. They've run 747s directly into the side of them and nothing happens at full speed. They're completely impregnable casks, and then they're placed inside of a special boat that has a double hull, and then they move them around in that way. And even if the thing were to sink, they would be able to recover them if necessary, but they can also have very long lifespan at the bottom of the ocean without difficulty. So so I think it is a manageable problem to actually ship it around, and probably if there's going to be a nuclear power plant in Ireland, it will be on a coast, so it'd be not difficult. It wouldn't have to go inland via roads. You could have a harbor, maybe a special harbor developed for it, especially if you had a large-scale nuclear power plant. In terms of the power sharing power with the UK, that's always a possibility. We have an interconnect already. We do send power, and there's probably going to be another interconnect built with Scotland. So that, I think that would solve that issue. The other thing is that you don't have to build a Hinkley Point C. You could build some sort of smaller reactors, a few smaller reactors, and then that would deal with that problem a little bit better than having just one gigantic one that's going to oversupply. Did I cover the questions?
Yeah, thanks. Neasa, is there anything you'd like to go into
Yeah,
there?
well, on your question about community ownership, I think that's a fair question, and but I think what we find with private, so there are some really good models, and actually some of the money that Germany spent in trying to make that move away from nuclear, they spent on some really, you know, interesting community ownership schemes around things like solar farms, which they almost operate like a cooperative, and they it's considered like kind of a hub for community employment as well. So it's kind of double jobbing. And I think those are really, I've been doing a bit of reading around them recently. And I think they're really worthwhile models to explore. And I think the reality is that, yes, when things fall through, the state, of course, could be in a position to pick up the tab. But as we know in Ireland, because of our huge reliance on the private sector, is that happens anyway. So like if you look at like big investments in the housing sector, if you look at big infrastructural investments, things like toll roads, the state often gets left on the hook to pay for other people's private profit. So to pay for perhaps something that's an investment in a community that doesn't run accordingly, you know, that could come about, but it's a better bet to me than constantly relying on the private sector. There's a question there, just somebody put in about privately owned and deregulated utilities. So I personally believe very much that there should be a referendum on the right to water. I can't believe we even need a referendum on that. That should be in. And I think that electricity production is probably more complex because of the way the ESB is structured. But when that is planned for the new government, listen, you know, like we tried to get the right to housing in there and it came out as a referendum on housing, which could be anything. So I could promise you nothing on that end. I do think, just to go back to the question around what size of nuclear power plants, I am, in fairness to Gavin, operating on the basis that we're not talking about anything like Hinkley. We're talking about maybe something that's like a third of the size. But I don't think any of those things really address the issue around how much power we use. So at the moment, Ireland is worried about our grid, but at the same time, we're and our water usage and thinking about, you know, tapping the Shannon. But at the same time, we're planning to build scores of data centers. Now, I would put forward the idea that perhaps we don't need to know whether you clicked a like or poked somebody on Facebook in 1998. Nobody needs to know that. And so we need to reimagine how much data we're storing. And so there's things like that we need to do. We need to look at how much energy we're actually using before we talk about exporting it or sharing it with anyone else.
Great. So there's another question there from Garrett, which I'll read out shortly. If I could just ask if there's anybody else with questions, maybe put your hand up now or indicate somehow that you'd like to come in, or put them there in the chat box. So Garrett had asked, what would the total land use required to meet current needs from wind be? So how much land would be required to meet our current needs using wind energy? And he says, I think wind currently provides 30% of power, excluding transport. Does anybody believe we could quadruple the amount of wind farms currently in Ireland, let alone build up all the pump storage required? And yeah, so if there's any thoughts.
Well, I for one, am not making the case for that, because, you know, as somebody who worked in the industry, kitting somebody out with some decent solar panels will cover 50% of their space heating for the year. So the idea that solar doesn't have a part to play here is just wrong. And I think what's really interesting as well is those ideas around solar farms, which would allow people who own land to really utilize it as part of the solution to these issues. I also actually am not a great fan of on-land wind. I think in the Irish context, we're such a dispersed, low density population. And I think best practice tends to be to have a wind turbine, you know, between 3 and 5 kilometers from the closest residence. You can't really do that anywhere in Ireland. And so I think offshore wind is a better option for us. And then you're into a discussion around levels of investment and you know, whether it's a market-led strategy or not, or whether it's a state-led strategy. So I don't think wind and land use in Ireland is a good combination. And if you see what we did before, you know, I would have some criticisms of what we did before, you know, in the noughties, where there wasn't full community consultation, and also, you know, we put in wind farms without environmental impacts assessments properly done. So I think, you know, I'm not making the case that wind is the silver bullet here.
Gavin, do you want to come in on that?
I mean, I actually have not calculated the full total land area use, but Garrett's right that it would be about probably more than 4 times, because currently it's around 23 to 25% of total power production is from wind, but it's very spiky, and it's very easy to turn on natural gas plants. They're quite efficient to turn on at a moment's notice, and so the way that that's balanced is using that and some smoothing with pumped water storage. So you'd actually have to probably go up to like five times what we currently have if you wanted to have a complete solution. That's going to be pretty you know, that's quite a lot of land use. But I think solar also doesn't really get us around the problem. The solar is more regular and reliable, but in the Irish context, it can't generate that much power. And although like places like Germany, they had very extensive solar programs and lots of sort of community grid community, you get to sell your power back to the grid. And then eventually they were just like, actually, we don't want your power anymore because it's disrupting the grid. It was actually throwing the grid off, because you don't get that reliable power. You get these big surges of power, and you don't really control how they're laid out. And, you know, it's all these people are trying to sell it in a particular area. It's a, you know, the power management should be a big centralized thing in the first place. It really has economies of scale, and I think that we should start thinking of it in that way, rather than trying to make it some ultra distributed project, because I don't think it doesn't fit well with it. Now, I noticed one other thing was that Hilfiger has said, my vague understanding was that the reasons nuclear power is so demonized is because uranium was historically privileged. This is the source for nuclear, and that's because it was used for weapons, and newer thorium reactors are much safer. Well, it is true that uranium was initially explored really as a weapon, and that's why uranium and not thorium doesn't make a good weapon. However, I don't think it's either here nor there. There are some designs for thorium reactors, the molten salt thorium reactor, but it's you can run the molten salt reactor on uranium as well. And I don't think it's particularly safer, although I think the molten salt reactor is a candidate for a much safer reactor. It doesn't have to run on thorium. It could run on any fissile fuel, really.
Okay, great. Okay, so there's 2 more questions there. So I'm just going to read those out. And what I might do then is just hand over to both Neasa and Gavin to address those questions any way they want, and also just to conclude. Yeah, and we'll probably wrap it up at that point, I think. There's a question from Hillary saying that effectively querying the timescale required for nuclear. It would be the only investment would take 15 years to build. Do we not need urgent development in renewables, which would come on stream much faster? And then the second question from Rory is asking around whether or not the Irish grid would be capable of being fully supplied with just renewables without a baseload energy in the way that gas is used in the UK and the US. He's comparing it to Germany, where it's recognized in Germany that it is impossible to that a baseload is required in some way, and he was speaking in favor of nuclear fusion.
Yeah, that's a really interesting discussion, and it's one that I've been trying to get my head around. The development of the 2 different technologies, fusion and fission, and how far away we are from it, because it sounds like the perfect solution. we are absolutely, definitely not at a position where we can supply our grid just from renewables. And I don't think anybody serious would be suggesting that. But I guess what I would suggest is that we are moving away from systems of energy where you have an always on model, and into a more integrated model with more options. And so having an always on, investing, billions and billions into an always on model that won't be ready for the next however many years might not actually be the best use of our money. And I agree with Hilary there that yes, it will take a long time to build. I mean, look, the reality is that we have a huge job of work to do to move away from fossil fuels, and that is going to take a number of years no matter what we do. But I do, again, want to stress, my feeling is that nuclear energy at the moment is a very financially unstable proposition as an industry. That's not because of renewables, that's because of the industry itself, and the difficulty it's run into. And therefore I think that financial instability and the development instability doesn't make it a good bet to invest in when it won't actually be turned on for 10 or 12 or 15 years. And if this is my wrap up, I'll just finish by saying that, again, we need to cut down how much energy we use, and nuclear energy, the big win is that we could continue to consume endlessly and infinitely into the future. And fundamentally as a sustainable model, that's not sustainable, and that's not the way we should be going. We should be looking for, instead of a technocratic solution, we should be looking for system change.
Thanks very much, Neasa. Very much appreciated. Gavin.
Yeah, I guess in terms of, I totally agree. We should be looking for system change, and like I said before, I'm in favor of reducing our energy usage. But to be frank, the best ways of reducing our energy usage are all large infrastructure projects. That's the reality of it. Nuclear power would actually facilitate this in a really great way. We could move to a completely rail and metro system, and using trams, metros, and trains as the primary means of transport. And that would be a big improvement in our total transport energy costs per capita. The other big one is really we need to be investing in apartment complexes, really, which will allow us to have heating systems which are much more efficient than are possible with our current brick row house kind of approach, which will be difficult even with retrofitting to bring to a reasonable level of greenhouse gas use. So I think in terms of my final remarks, I think that although it will take a long time to get nuclear power online, I would point back to who has reduced greenhouse gases fastest historically, and the fastest historical reductions have all taken place with nuclear programs. And currently in Europe, outside of Norway and Iceland, where Norway has an extremely large hydropower system, which is not going to be feasible in Ireland, and Iceland, which has geothermal. France is really close to the lowest greenhouse gas release. 75% of their power is from nuclear power, and they got that way by building a big nuclear system. So although it takes a long time, the total amortized greenhouse gases that we would release in the long run would be vastly lower than if we try to do it the other way. I don't think it's possible to feasibly go to a zero baseload power system without really gargantuan levels of construction and investment that really make a nuclear power plant look small. Because I think everyone should just do a quick Google search of Turlock Hill and imagine 500 of them and think about where they're going to put them. So, and if we don't build that to get rid of our greenhouse gases, what's it going to be? And like, even if we dropped to a fraction of our current, if we manage to increase efficiency to 25% of our current power use, we would still be releasing too much greenhouse gases. And I don't think without changing it, I don't think we'll be able. I think we can increase wind to probably around 60%, and then we'll find it impossible to go the final remaining 40%, and the rest of that will be made up with natural gas in practice.
Great. Okay. Well, look, thanks very much to Neasa and to Gavin for those contributions. I think it's one of those issues where there probably is a genuine range of opinions in many political organisations. So it's great to be able to have the debate. We're encouraging anybody from the general public and indeed from our own party who has an interest and the time to write a submission to do so. We're genuinely interested to hear people's perspectives and are happy to publish anything constructive if you would like us to. So please do feel free to submit any of your thoughts. I'm going to call things to a close formally and stop the recording and turn off Facebook Live. But if anybody is interested in, I suppose, chatting less formally or has any informal questions, feel free to stick around and I'll leave the meeting space open. But thanks again to Neasa and Gavin. I really appreciate your contributions. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Thanks.
Bye.